Okay, so thank you very much for watching this video. We are here today. The purpose of this is to talk about the Law Commission consultation which has been released on leasehold reform. This document is 534 pages long, and we estimate that if we talked about every question, of which there are 136 questions with lots of sub-questions in that even if we spent 3 or 4 minutes on each one, it would take us around 8.5 hours to talk you through the various proposals the government has made. So we're not going to do that. But what we wanted to do, because we've been given so many, we've been contacted so many times by people asking us what they should do, what they should respond to, is that we have essentially got what we think are the most important questions that we should answer in the consultation document, and we're going to talk through some of those, hopefully change the language from the legalese into something more that we can all understand, and we'll go through these questions, and hopefully this will help a lot of people who are struggling to answer the questions that we have. So before I get started, I'd like to introduce everyone who's here. So Jo, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Jo Derbyshire. I'm one of the co-founders of the National Leasehold Campaign.
I'm Kendrick. I am the founder of the National Leasehold Campaign, which was set up in January 2017 and which has over 12,000 members who are all stuck in this leasehold mess that we are currently in.
I'm Chris Last. I'm a solicitor with Leasehold Law and I practice in the field of leasehold enfranchisement.
My name's Louie Burns. I'm a trustee of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership along with Jo Derbyshire there. I'm also managing director of Leasehold Solutions, Leasehold Law and Leasehold Valuers. So before we get going, again, these are what we think, after reading the consultation, we think are the most important questions to answer. We're not really trying to give you the answers that you should put in this document. That is your decision, what you think is important and what you want to answer. But I think it's really important, and the reason we're doing this is it's very important that the consultation has lots of responses, because if people who are kind of weighed down with the amount of consultations that are currently coming out about leasehold reform, in fact, as we're speaking now, there's another consultation that's just been released on ground rent, and we were going to have Sebastian O'Kelly, who's also from the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, but he's now tied down with work dealing with that consultation. But if leaseholders don't respond to the consultation, then that will be seized on by the freeholders to say, well, there's no real appetite to change legislation and people don't really care about it. It can't be a big as problem as people say. So we think it's really important that we get as many people as we can to respond to the consultation.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think the other point that I'd make is, the Law Commission have done what they can with the terms of reference they were given, and be really clear that the terms of reference were given to them by the government, and to a certain extent, in my opinion, the Law Commission have had their hands tied behind the back in terms of what they can do with enfranchisement. So I think lots of us will have issues with some of the proposals in here, but we need to make sure that we don't just blame the Law Commission for that. We really need to keep the focus and the attention on government and government officials to do what's right.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So in the consultation, there are 136 questions. You're not expected to answer them all. So the question that they want you to answer at the beginning, which is probably the easiest to answer, is your name, address, and a little bit about you. So they expect you to answer that. And then you can pick and choose through the questions. So regardless of what issues you have, there's probably something in that consultation around service charges, changing the ridiculously complex qualifying criteria for enfranchisement, etc. So what we're trying to do is, when we read these questions, we will give you the reference of where this question is in the document, and that will enable you to go straight there if you feel that you wish to answer that. Has anyone got anything else to say before we move into our...
No, it's Well, basically, I'd just like to say that please do not be put off by the size of this consultation, and it's paramount that as many people complete it as well as you possibly can, and everybody's well will be, there's different thresholds, and that's absolutely fine. Just so that you do have some element of input into this, because it's absolutely crucial if we're going to bring about this big change that we need.
And the last question that you answer, you could actually miss all the questions out and just put what you're bothered about. But it is better if you could answer some of them. So, as we said before, Katie and Joe are from the National Leasehold Campaign, and they're here as educated leaseholders. I work in leasehold, and I'm very used to speaking about this complex subject and putting it into more palatable English, and Chris is the only bona fide expert here, so his role is to explain the complex things and to keep us on the straight and narrow. So I'm going to jump straight into what we think the first important question in the consultation is, and it's question number 2, which you will find at 4.38 page 60 of the government's consultation. And it says, we provisionally propose that leaseholders of both houses and flats should be entitled, as often as they wish, and on a payment of a premium, to obtain a new extended lease at a nominal ground rent. So that might not sound like it, but it's quite a radical reform that they are proposing. Chris, can you tell us how that differs from what we've got now?
Well, at present, if you own a leasehold of a house, you're entitled to a 50-year lease extension at no premium. So you pay no premium for that lease extension, but the ground rent will revert to a market rent, which essentially makes the house almost impossible to sell. The marketability of the house plummets entirely as soon as you avail yourself of that lease extension. Conversely, with flats, you're entitled to purchase a 90-year lease extension at what we call a peppercorn ground rent, which in plain English means a 0 ground rent. So your ground rent will reduce to nil, and 90 years will be added onto the existing term of the lease, and then the lease will run at that extended term for the rest of its duration. So the proposal here within the Law Commission seems to be that they want to create a uniform right between leaseholders of houses and leaseholders of flats.
And that is quite a radical change because, as Chris said, these two different, if you've got a house, you work under the 67 Act, and it seems quite a formless piece of legislation, and the 1993 Act, which deals with lease extensions, is much more prescribed. But I think just for leaseholders, having the opportunity to know whether you've got a house or a flat, that it's quite a good thing. So that is a radical proposal, and one that we think is very important. Go on.
So, the next question we consider to be important is question number 3, which you'll find at 4.42, starting at page 61. We invite the views of consultees as to whether the right to a lease extension should in all cases be a right to an extended term at a nominal ground rent, or whether leaseholders should also have the choice to extend the lease without changing the ground rent, or to extinguish the ground rent without extending the lease. This is, again, quite a radical departure from where we are at the minute, because the right to alter the ground rent with reference to flats only exists when you extend the lease, or if you were to enter into some sort of private agreement, which I think we have experienced can be very unfavourable.
Yeah, I mean, this worries me that they're considering giving the option to maybe save a bit of money on the lease extension and play around with the ground rent, or leave it as it is, because it is akin to what is an informal lease extension. And anyone who's read or heard me speak will know that I'm very passionate against informal lease extensions. And really what you're doing, especially now with this additional focus on leasehold, is having the ability for freeholders to bamboozle leaseholders into accepting deals just because they'll save a bit of money on the premium. Seems like a really worrying proposal for me.
I think for me, I was thinking there's a real danger that people make short-term decisions without thinking of what the consequences are further down. And that, you know, most of us who are trapped in this leasehold scandal done so because we were poorly advised and missold. And I think there's a real danger that if that's not done properly, exactly the same thing's going to happen all over again.
We were at a meeting last week where someone from Google was using Google Analytics to tell us how many people now Google leasehold issues. And over the last 18 months, the number of people Googling leasehold issues has risen exponentially. And that means if you take a little deal because it saves you a bit of money, you may end up with an unsaleable flat or one that's damaged, the value is damaged because you've done this quick deal. So we think that's a really important one. And almost on the back of that, question 7, which is 4.94, page 71 of the consultation document, says, do consultees consider that the ability of parties to enter into a lease extension outside the 1967 and 1993 Acts create significant problems in practice? So just to explain that, as we said before, the 1967 Act controls the enfranchisement of houses if you wanted to buy your freehold, and the 1993 Act controls the lease extension process for flats. So this is asking us whether we think this ability to step outside the Act and ban informal lease extensions essentially is a good thing. And I'll get your views in a second, but this is something I do feel very passionate about, because we see every single day that maybe half the lease extensions that are done every year in this country are done by way of this informal lease extension. And the freeholders use a carrot on a stick approach to save a tiny bit of money, but for themselves they build a huge income for the next 20 or 30 years, often completely stripping that property of any value. So I don't know if anyone's got any views on this question.
It would strike me as being quite a radical proposal to limit the capacity of anyone to enter into a private agreement, but it reflects the importance of the consultation as a whole and the importance of the issues that we're currently facing, that it's even been put forward. And I think it's probably fair to say a lot of the concerns that you get raised within the campaign are given rise to as a result of these informal lease extensions. Where, as you've already brought up, proper advice hasn't necessarily been given to people when they're entering into them, and they find themselves trapped.
To me, it just leaves open another loophole that can be exploited, which is how we've all got into this mess. And I thought the whole idea of all of this reform is to close those loopholes. So giving an alternative is to give another get out of ways that they can just exploit it again.
Agree. I mean, all of us here would prefer leasehold to be abolished, and if the second best thing that we've got is to work with this consultation, then we want all those doors to be closed.
Absolutely.
And you know, if I had more time, I could tell you some horror stories of informal lease extensions that we've dealt with. A lot of them even been in the press. That the terms have been so awful that people can't believe how horrible that is. So I really think shutting that would be a good thing
it seems like it's consumer protection, and it's needed where a market isn't working for consumers, and this one clearly isn't.
No.
The next question we've considered is question 13, which can be found at paragraph 5.24 at page 80 of the consultation paper. We provisionally propose that where an individual freehold acquisition claim is made, the leaseholder should be entitled to a transfer of the whole of the building in which his or her residential unit is situated, even if parts of the building are not included within his or her existing lease, and the whole of his or her premises let under the existing lease, whether or not the entirety of those premises falls within the curtilage of the building, and there should be no statutory deadline or time limit for landlords to propose that other land originally let to leaseholder but now assigned to another should also be included in the transfer, or that parts of the premises that are above or below other premises in which he has an interest should be excluded from the transfer. And I know that was a rather a lengthy question. I perhaps should have broken it down. That's one of the more complicated questions within the whole consultation. I think we'd all agree, and it looks both at rights and processes that currently apply. The long and the short of it is a suggestion that when a freehold is purchased by a leaseholder, that they're going to take the freehold of what they understand to be their property under the lease. So at the minute, there are certain exclusions within the 1967 Act, certainly, and again within the 1993 Act, whereby a freeholder can retain parts of the premises that the claim purports to be over. What this consultation is seeking to do is to remove a freeholder's capacity to do that, and also remove a freeholder's capacity to late in the day of the claim say, oh, actually, there's part of the building that we would like to retain now, or part of the premises, more likely we would like to retain, perhaps by seeking an optional lease back or something like that. We've seen a few of these in the work that we do.
It sounds complicated, but in reality, when leaseholders want to buy their freehold, they don't have automatic rights over some of the common parts on a building, and freeholders will often spitefully try and retain a bit of land or a certain part of the building to be awkward, to be able to still charge leaseholders. And it's something actually we go to tribunal a lot over.
Is this where you see like the loft space and things like that?
It could be loft space, it could be a part of the garden. We've just been to the upper tribunal, a huge battle that's rumbled on for years, where the freeholder wanted to keep a revocable right. He wanted the leaseholders to pay for the garden, but he wanted the right retained when they paid for it, that he could revoke their ability to use that land. So whenever he wanted to say you can't use the garden anymore, he wanted that right. Well, we've just been to the upper tribunal and spent many tens of thousands of pounds arguing over that point. So this is quite a radical question, because if leaseholders want to buy their building, they can get it lock, stock and barrel. They can do that. We think it's a really important question to be in this.
It's a good thing by the sounds of it. I mean, what strikes me when we go through these questions is how you need the experience and the knowledge that you guys have got to have seen all these different scenarios to understand what they're actually getting at. But this is one that sounds like, again, where they're trying to kind of close some of those loopholes and make things better for leaseholders.
And that's what encourages me with the proposal. Although it's complex, some of these battles we fought for years and years, and they do genuinely seem to want to close the door on game playing, and often freeholders will be very unreasonable when the freehold's being sold as a way to kind of bloody the nose of the leaseholders, or try and gain some kind of positioning. And buying your freehold is more complicated than you could imagine. It's almost Kafkaesque in its complexity. And leaseholders facing to say, well, let's just get rid of our freeholder and buy this building. I think that's a really important question.
Could I just say on this one, it is important though, you mentioned that these are complicated questions. It's important people aren't too intimidated by them, and in taking the time to put their responses in, just break them down into individual parts and answer them bit by bit if necessary, because they do eventually come to make sense. I will openly admit I've had to read one or two of them 3, 4, 5, 6 times before I've understood what they were getting at.
Well, when I read it for the first time, I read it in one sitting, but I was drinking a bottle of red wine, and it seemed to make more sense. It just kind of seemed to make more sense as I went through. Off the back of that, the next question is again, there are some questions in between this that deal with enfranchisement rights and qualifying criteria. It seems very complex. But for any leaseholders who've been through the process of trying to buy their freehold, it will make a lot of sense. But the next question we've picked up on is question 25, which is 6.93, page 114 on the government's consultation. It says that we provisionally propose that the right of collective freehold acquisition, so leaseholders wanting to buy their freehold, should extend to the acquisition of the freehold of the entire estate or of multiple buildings. So it rolls on that. Can you explain that a bit to us, Chris?
Absolutely. So at present, your right is to enfranchise to buy the freehold of a building containing flats and the pertinent premises, so the premises around that are usually enjoyed with that, or to buy the freehold of a leasehold house and the premises around it, so the gardens, outhouses, sheds, garages and the such. What can happen is you could have an estate comprising a block of flats with some houses next door, and there is no right at present for the group of leaseholders within that estate, and the word estate here is vitally important, to buy the freehold of all of the buildings and all of the land. At the minute, the entitlement is to buy the freehold of the block of flats and the land that's enjoyed with the block of flats up to a certain point, and to individually buy the freehold of the houses and the land that's enjoyed with the houses But in most cases I've seen, you would normally end up buying, say each individual were to buy their freehold and the block were to buy their freehold as well, there will be some patches of the estate left out. So what this proposal is putting forward, it's an incredibly advanced idea to what we have at the minute, is that a group of people, no matter what their interests are, whether it's within a flat or within a house, they will have the right to collectively purchase the freehold of their estate as a whole. And what's further to that, what's quite interesting is no one would be limited, if you were in a house, say, from then buying the freehold of your house individually once the freehold of the estate has been purchased. So nobody could be deemed to be having their rights taken away. You're just having an additional right layered on top to what's there at the minute, so that the entire interest can be taken. What tends to be the problem with the system at present is that the freehold can be purchased and these patches of land or property are left, and then estate charges are levied against people who believe they've bought their freehold, but then they're still tied to these often quite excessive management fees, estate charges.
Fees,
It's a really important.
That's huge, then, isn't it? Really,
because
I know it's a massive issue.
It's really important for people who want to, build community and have autonomy of their own buildings. It's a very radical reform.
What's important to note as well, I think maybe some people will be concerned, anybody who's already exercised their existing right to buy the freehold, under this proposal, that right would be unaffected, as it's been drafted within the consultation paper. So if there is an estate with a block of flats and some houses, or say multiple blocks of flats, if one of those blocks of flats, say, or any of the houses or any number of the houses have already bought their freehold, there wouldn't then be a prohibition on everybody else buying the freehold of the estate. So at no point would anyone have their existing rights that they've exercised under the current legislation taken away from them. I think that's quite an important point to preserve.
It is. It's good.
But they wouldn't be able to purchase the extra land within the estate because they've already purchased their freehold.
This would be a point that needs to be raised within the consultation, that even if you have bought your freehold already, are you going to be given a gateway within which you can participate in the estate purchase? And I think it'd be quite important to include that.
I guess where leaseholders with estate management charges are going to be interested is, does this give me a way out of estate management charges?
Yes.
Well, there are some questions that deal with that around these questions in the consultation, which would specifically apply to estate charges for maybe an estate of houses. So anyone reading this document who is in that position where they're currently paying huge estate charges should look at those questions, because it's their chance to respond. Okay. What's interesting around all this, not really one of the questions that we are dealing with, but it is worth talking about just to illustrate how ridiculously complex and totally mental leasehold is the government are looking to change the definition of the word house, because by law they don't know what a house is. And it's hard to understand that hundreds of thousands of pounds, 2 cases have gone to the High Court trying to define what a house is, but they've still not been able to do it. So the consultation says we're going to call it a residential unit. I think that those people should have just watched Play School, here's a house. They'd have done that straight away. So Chris, question 31, Chris.
We provisionally propose to introduce a new power for leaseholders exercising the right of collective freehold acquisition, so buying the freehold as a block, to insist, if they so choose, that the freeholder take a lease back or lease backs of all parts of the premises other than the common parts which are not let to participating leaseholders. So in essence, this is saying where there are units within a building, so flats within a building that are comprising of flats that do not have a lease over them at the minute, or have a different type of lease over them at the minute, like an assured short-hold tenancy, that the freeholder is retained, that the freeholder could be compelled to buy, to take a lease back, of that when the leaseholders collectively buy their freehold. The upshot of that, the long and the short of it is, the premium will be a lot cheaper, because at present, if there is a flat within a building where a long lease hasn't been granted over it, and the freeholder doesn't take a lease back of that when the freehold is purchased, the leaseholders who are collectively buying their freehold are essentially buying that flat outright.
Right.
If the freeholder can be required to retain that flat, the chunk of premium will be retained by the freeholder essentially in the proprietary interest in that flat.
And that in our experience, that when leaseholders buy the freehold, that's one of the biggest hurdles they have to overcome is funding the non-participant angle of that. And it's really good that it's been recognised here, because that is singularly the biggest problem you'll experience if you wanted to buy your block of flats. If you know, there's a legal minimum requirement that 50% take part, and then you have to find a way to fund those non-participants. And we're doing a freehold acquisition at the moment where the freeholder is making us buy 2 flats that he owns with no lease as a way of trying to scupper the freehold acquisition, because as well as everyone having to do that, they've got to get 2 mortgages, buy the flats, and then hope someone sells them later on. So it's a really important
because you do tend to find as well that the non-participants are on the valuation basis the expensive ones. So when you break down the overall cost of the freehold as it stands at the minute, and we will obviously be getting onto the valuation side of things shortly, but when you break it down, there will be certain flats that will be contributing more to the freehold cost than others, because they might say, for example, have a shorter lease, a higher ground rent, other factors like that. They're less likely to want to participate in some circumstances, so as a result there's an enormous amount of capital that needs to be raised. So if a freeholder could be required to take that interest back, then the leaseholder is going to be a great deal better off when they come to buy.
And I think just to kind of move on to the last bit of question 37, which is on page 131, which is trying to gauge the implications of this. It asks the question, would this reform result in a higher proportion of leaseholders seeking to exercise the right of collective freehold acquisition? Well, for people who want leasehold to be abolished, if it doesn't seem that leasehold is going to be abolished in this legislation that we've got going on currently, then your option is to get rid of your freeholder completely and take control of your own building and your own destiny. And this is a big step in helping that happen, that people go, okay, well, let's just get rid of them, let's take control of our own building. And so I think question 37 is one that really needs, even if you're not currently thinking of buying your freehold, with an eye to the future, that is the answer. That's how you get rid of your freeholder, is to buy the freehold. And this makes it much easier for leaseholders. So I'm going to read question 42. It's quite a quick one, this, but it's very important. So question 42 will be found 8.75 on page 182. And it says, we provisionally propose that the requirement to own premises for 2 years before exercising enfranchisement rights in respect of those premises should be abolished. So do you want to talk this through? Yeah.
Well, the original intention behind this was to discourage speculators and investors from buying a flat, availing themselves of the statutory right to a lease extension, and then selling it quickly, and thus taking a profit. In reality, you can get around it. It's relatively simple to be assigned the benefit of a lease extension claim and purchase a flat, and you take the benefit of the claim on purchase. And if you're a property investor, you will, I'm certain, have a solicitor who's able to do that. So the effect of this rule at the minute is simply to inhibit those who maybe don't have specialist solicitors working for them, and they're left having to wait 2 years. Now, obviously, if you're on the threshold of the 80-year limit at the minute, that can create an enormous disparity in what you would be paying from day one of purchase to the end of 2 years after purchase. It seems like a sensible rule to abolish, which I struggle to see what the negative impact would be on.
I think it's really good. I think it's a really good thing. It just makes it easier for everyone. Question 50, Chris, if you could do that.
Yes, at 8.145, page 196. We provisionally propose to remove the requirement that, in the case of a building containing only 2 residential units, both leaseholders must participate in a collective freehold acquisition claim.
Well, I think this is really important for the hundreds of thousands of masonettes when there's just 2 properties, and currently both have to agree to act. And now this is a really freeing way that the rights to enfranchise are expanded. This would affect positively many hundreds of thousands and possibly maybe 1 million leaseholders in this country. So, question 51, 8.148, page 197. We provisionally propose to remove the current prohibition on leaseholders of 3 or more flats in a building being qualifying tenants for the purpose of a collective enfranchisement claim. Chris?
So at present, if you're making a collective enfranchisement claim, so a group of leaseholders buying the freehold of their building, whether a building comprising flats, any one leaseholder who owns 3 or more flats in that building may not participate in the claim. Further to that, their flats don't count as qualifying flats, so it can end up disqualifying the building entirely, where at present you need 2/3 of the flats in the building to be held by qualifying tenants.
Right, okay.
So say you have a building containing 9 flats, if 5 of those are owned by one person, that building cannot be subject to a collective enfranchisement claim. The freehold cannot be forcibly purchased. Again, this was brought in initially to discourage investors, but it's relatively easy to get around. It's simply a case of transferring proprietary interests. If you're holding through a company, you could find an associated sister, parent, other company to take the interest. I'm sure people would have mums, dads, daughters, sons, brothers, sisters, husbands, wives who would also willingly take the transfer in order to get around this rule. It's a rule that's there at the minute that doesn't really serve an enormous purpose.
Again, I'd add that this is a massive blockage to being able to buy freeholds from leaseholders, and I do understand why that was put in. But now, I mean, we're doing some work in Leeds at the moment where everyone's very keen to buy the freeholds of some blocks. And some of the most engaged leaseholders there actually own multiple flats, but are, you know, very keen to keep the building looking nice, and it's their investment, and they're excluded from doing this. Some of those blocks we can't enfranchise because there are not enough qualifying tenants because of this rule. So again, really simplifying it and making it much better for leaseholders, I think.
It's important to note as well, the world has changed since the early 90s when this legislation was brought in. There are a great, you know, we're approaching 30 odd years on from when this legislation was considered. There are people who own multiple buildings, multiple flats, sorry, and they have them as their investment portfolio, and they are, as Louie said, excluded from participating in the benefit and the welfare of their building.
Encouraged by pensions legislation changes as well.
Yes.
People investing for pensions.
Yeah, for sure. This one's very quick, and it's a kind of tiny bit tautological, but question 70 says, we provisionally propose that a single procedure should apply to all enfranchisement rights. Just it's worth saying a sentence to say that it's so complicated, and having to learn 2 pieces of legislation, which is just ridiculous. I think this is important because once a single procedure is established, more people will be able to learn it, become more leaseholders will be able to come conversant with it and understand it. You've just got this one thing to learn, and I think that's really important to do. Question 94, please, Chris.
At paragraph 12.44, page 343, we provisionally propose that the current division of responsibility for the resolution of enfranchisement disputes and issues between the county court and tribunal should end. All such matters should be determined by the tribunal. So at present there's a dual jurisdiction between the first tier tribunal, property chamber, and leasehold valuation tribunal in Wales, and the county court in deciding certain issues depending what they are. Some things can be decided in both, which can get a bit complicated. So the proposal is very much in the vein of question 70, simplify the procedure, simplify the process, make it so that there is one destination which has a jurisdiction to decide all of these things, and that's where everybody knows they need to go.
And consequently keep costs down.
That would hopefully be the plan. My one point I would consider about this is that it would need appropriate funding for the first tier tribunal, that I suspect would need to expand in order to accommodate what we would anticipate to be an increase in the number of applications.
And that leads on nicely actually to the next one, which is question 95, 12.61, page 347, which says we invite the views and consultees of whether it would be desirable for a certain valuation-only disputes to be determined by a single valuation expert rather than the tribunal. So by far the most tribunal cases revolve around this ridiculous, counterintuitive way of valuing lease extensions, and it's a tool that freeholders regularly use to bully leaseholders, because the cost of going to tribunal, if your freeholder's got a barrister and a solicitor and a valuer,
so off-putting.
And honestly, I've been to so many of these things where we've argued them on behalf of leaseholders. It's like Groundhog Day. You could literally have recorded your last arguing, but it costs leaseholders, you know, thousands of pounds to go
the
there.
same argument again and again.
But I feel cautious who the judge is going to be and what his, you know, what his view will be. But on the whole, I think it's probably a positive move for leaseholders, depending who the valuing judge is. Question 98, Chris?
Yeah, that's at 13.49, page 361. We invite the views of consultees as to whether leaseholders should be required to make any contribution to their landlord's non-litigation costs. So at the minute, leaseholders are required to pay the landlord's reasonable legal and valuation costs when a lease extension or freehold purchase claim is made. What's being considered here is whether or not those costs, the valuation and legal costs, should be payable at all, or if they are payable, to what extent.
So that answers question 99, actually, whether it should be a fixed cost, capped costs. Why leaseholders should have to pay their legal fees of their multimillionaire freeholder kind of defeats me. Let everyone, in my view, it's cutting. But this is a really important radical change, and it's also important because most of the people who work in enfranchisement want to work for freeholders because they get really good money from it and they get regular work. This would be a shift, a paradigm shift in who has the power in leasehold, because suddenly freeholders would have to pay their own fees. Those fees would fall, and solicitors would now start to be looking more, and valuers to act for leaseholders. So I think this is really important, a big paradigm shift, and I can't see any reason why any money should be paid for it. I don't know if you've got a view on that.
I think the interesting bit for me when I read the document was that the Law Commission themselves think this is a really finely balanced argument. So back to your weight of numbers thing, I think we really need to make it clear that people need to respond, and they need to respond about how ridiculous it is, so that it's not seen as a finely balanced argument between leaseholders and freeholders. It's just nonsense.
That is actually the line they use in the consultation report, isn't it? It's a finely balanced argument.
Yeah.
And it's not, it's completely one-sided. So all of that has brought us to the last question, and this is by far the most important question for most leaseholders, because even the consultations and the press releases that came out for the consultations today, the government said that they cannot intervene in contractual law. Poor old freeholders would lose their money, and they've got human rights. We all believe that it's time to put the leaseholders' human rights at the forefront. And so the only real help, except for these changes, which by and large there's some really good changes that the Law Commission have put forward, if they ever make it into law, and that's why we need leaseholders to respond to this. But now we come to this question of valuation, because the big thing here is how much is it going to cost you to extend your lease or buy your freehold. And currently that world is just ridiculously complex, convoluted. Virtually every lease extension you could argue based on evidence. You need a qualified professional to calculate this for you, and they're going to charge you quite a lot of money to do it, which in itself is ridiculous. And so this is by far, for most people watching this, the most important thing. So the government have said that they intend to make the cost of a lease extension or freehold acquisition clearer, simpler, and more transparent and cheaper. Did I put cheaper in there?
Cost effective. They seem to change the language somewhere along the line.
Cheaper. We're going to say cheaper.
Cheaper to
We're
cost
going to say
effective.
Theresa May definitely promised.
It was cheap originally, and I'm sure there's one place in that report they've forgotten to change it from cheap.
Well, I remember when I watched the dancing that's what she said. So there are different options that they are putting forward, and this seems to be the most important question. So we're going to get Chris to read 108 first, and we'll discuss that quickly.
We invite the views of consultees as to whether a separate simplified valuation regime should be created for low value and or straightforward enfranchisement claims, and how such low value and or straightforward claims should be identified. So what this I believe is looking at is the sort of lease extension claims where we're not going to be dealing with high premiums. I would suggest they will be almost exclusively lease extension claims, very few collective enfranchisements, though there may be some potentially freehold purchase of houses where we're not dealing with enormous premiums, we're not dealing with enormous differentials in the valuation bases, and whether or not we can strip down ultimately the way in which it's calculated, and thus strip down the costs that are payable in order to get that calculated and get the disputes about the premium determined.
So this could apply to maybe an older leasehold house that has a small, minimal amount of ground rent payable every year, those kinds of
There
houses.
are a few hundred houses up north where the ground rent is £2 or £5 a year, so I think there's a genuine, I think this is the big question, because I personally feel, and I've been to a lot of meetings at the Law Commission and with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Governments, I genuinely feel that there is a real drive from the government to genuinely make this cheaper. But on the other side, you have the human rights of freeholders who own these freeholds by contractual law. So nobody made any leaseholders sign this with a gun to the head, and that's their argument. And so the government have to try and get through this without being stuck with a big bill, because if they made a difference to this valuation, the freeholders, who are amongst the richest people in this country and the very elite of this country in many cases, would immediately sue the government for, and that's trillions of pounds. And so broadly speaking, there are different things that they're putting forward. So first of all, they are talking about what we will now call the Justin Madders method of doing this. And do you remember what he proposed?
A multiple of ground rent.
So he had multiple of ground
10 times the ground rent.
10 times the ground rent. So I believe that the second reading of his bill is what?
26th of October.
Yeah, it's the end of the month.
Yeah, that's the current
So he's
one.
going to put that forward. So if you felt that the fairest way of calculating this would be 10 times your ground rent, then you should answer this question categorically to
And
say.
there are also some precedents for that as well. So when leasehold was abolished in Scotland and Ireland, that was the way that it was done.
Yeah.
With certain value, it was where I believe it was where the ground rent was below £100 a year, then the ground rent multiplier was used, absolutely, in Scotland, yes.
Yeah, and the one that strikes me is, I've got one of the modern doubling ground rents, is that my freeholder bought the freehold on my home for 15 times the ground rent. So it seems outrageous to me that we have to go through this convoluted process when the person who owns my freehold didn't go through it when they bought it off the developer in the first place. How can that be right?
Well, that's ground rents have been bought and sold for the last 200 years on years purchase out. This multiple of ground rent. So yeah, it is, and we've got to calculate ground rent, reversion, marriage value, and a no act rights deduction to get to the same thing. So it isn't equitable, but hopefully these will sort that. The second radical proposal they have made is something that's called term and reversion. So generally when we calculate a lease extension, there are 3 different ways that we have to compensate the freeholder this ground rent, reversion and marriage value. Each of those has a calculation and a variable that we've got to argue over. That gives us the figure. But the Law Society are proposing that we get rid of this last one, marriage value. So term and reversion means really we just calculate the ground rent owed and the reversion, the reversionary element, those 2 things, and we completely ignore ground rent, marriage value from that proposal. Now that would massively help anyone whose lease has already fallen below 80 years, in a monstrous way, in some, especially with short leases. But have you got any views on that, any of you?
The initial arguments against marriage value when the statute was debated some 20, 30 years ago, the arguments against it were that it was a payment of the premium twice. And I think that that's the Law Commission's basis for, as shown in the consultation, for scrapping it now. That a premium has already been paid for the property, so on what basis should a second premium be paid? And there does seem to have been a revival of those arguments which were dismissed in the early 1990s.
Does it open the door for a speculator to come in and suddenly, you know, on the day the law's changed or the day before, buy a number of properties where that price would have been low and then suddenly it's going to be less?
Certainly in London, if this came in, then people would be trying to buy those properties like sweets, because you know, some properties that we're dealing with at the moment got 17-year leases in St John's Wood, and the lease extension on each of those is around £220,000. If that disappeared overnight and that property was still valued the same amount, you've made a nice profit.
Thanks for that bit of insider trading information.
I
should use that wisely.
Suggest that anyone does it. And then the final thing being proposed is that of these three big proposals is that instead of getting rid of these things, and both of those seem probably more unlikely than the final proposal that they've made, and that is where they prescribe these variables that we have. So with ground rents, we have to agree a capitalisation rate, and suddenly there's a lot of interest from freeholders, especially the guys who bought your homes, to argue a much lower capitalisation rate, and that makes the price rise exponentially. So the government's talking about possibly prescribing that rate, so there's no argument, and maybe reviewing it every 10 or 15 years, possibly by the Bank of England. The second variable we have is the deferment rate with the reversion, and that's kind of been prescribed by a court case called Sportelli, but they're talking about prescribing that. And then the big one is this relativity, so when your lease has gone below 80 years, that's what we argue about most, is relativity. How much value has your property lost because it's gone below 80 years, and freeholders argue that virtually the value of your property is completely gone, because the lower the relativity rate, the more you have to pay for your lease extension. And then there's this fourth thing which is called a no-ax right reduction, which you'll be glad to know I'm not going to bore you with because we're running out of time. So
just to put some of those things into context, so I have a new build, so the only one that applies is my ground rent. So
would be capitalisation rate for you.
Yeah, but if you've got a lease that's below 80 years, then at the moment the reversion bit and the marriage value comes into the calculation. And in terms of the capitalisation rate, that can have a huge effect, one that's quite difficult to even get your head round. So I have my ground rent's £295, it doubles every 10 years. You know, I'm currently looking at around £30,000 to franchise and buy my freehold on a capitalisation rate of circa 7%-ish. If that was to drop to sort of 2-3%, I'm looking at a ridiculous figure, like 120 grand more.
It's just mental.
You know, so it's so sensitive to that capitalisation rate. And
it's the same with deferment rates. If you knock 1% off a deferment rate and your property's worth more than £300,000, the difference is eye-watering. And then the battle that we constantly have over relativity. So for anyone wanting to answer those questions, this really is the most important bit for leaseholders. And whichever you feel, I mean, it's very difficult. Most of us would like Justin's doubling, 10 times the ground rent. Freeholders would not like that very much, and there would be a legal battle. But we're not particularly too worried about their sensibilities and how they feel about it. So we really believe it's time to put leaseholders' human rights. These guys have been making money from leaseholders for the last nearly 1,000 years. They've made the money, and it's time to bring the housing market of this country into the 21st century.
Well, my freeholder was happy to buy my freehold for 15 times the ground rent, so funny how when the shoe's on the other foot, or whatever the phrase is. Hey.
So we even that, just doing those questions, we've torn through them, and some of the questions in there are much more complex. The reason that we've wanted to do this and to put this effort in is we know it's daunting to answer this consultation, but it's so important. The last time this was looked at in any kind of meaningful way, and we'll sidestep the 2002 debacle of Commonhold, the last time legislation was looked at was 1993. And so we have got it open. We've got a chance to make a difference, and we need as many people as we can. And what would even listening to this, what's your message to the 12,000 people who follow your Facebook page?
Just take the time to answer the questions as best as you can. It doesn't matter what your knowledge base is. Anything's better than nothing. And at the end of the day, you know, I'm one of those people that, you know, if something needs changing, I need to be part of that change, and there's no point in moaning about it if you're not going to have some input into changing things, because Brilliant. This is the only way that we can change it, is if you have that input. And this is our golden opportunity that doesn't crop up very often, and we just need to make the most of it. I can't stress how important it is. So if people aren't active within our national leasehold campaign, this is the one time where you have to be active. Otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, you might as well just leave, because the planet or the country? you might as well leave the planet and move to
Mars.
Somewhere that doesn't have leasehold.
We have to make change.
But you know, we have to ask the question: why are people in the campaign? They either want change or they don't, and they can be part of that change. So,
and I think kind of the question everyone's going to ask is: so if I'm looking at buying my freehold, should I do it now? That we get asked that question so many times. And it's such a difficult question to answer, isn't it? Because it depends on everybody's personal circumstances
are different. If they've got a physical need, or you know, maybe they've been offered the right of first refusal, which tends to be quite advantageous sometimes, possibly. If you need to extend your lease because it's going to drop below 80 years, or you need to sell, then you have a physical need. But really, no one can answer these questions. No. The truth of it is, you know, Chris has done this virtually his whole life. I've done this for 10 years. You girls have been involved in this. None of us know where this is going to go, and anyone who pretends that we have an idea where this legislation is going to lead is wrong, because none of us know how this is going to play out. So you can only make your own decisions, really. And Chris, what would you live and breathe this stuff? This stuff actually makes sense to you. But what would your advice be to leaseholders as a final comment?
My main piece of advice would be, please don't be intimidated by the wording of the consultation. Please don't be intimidated by the length of the consultation. The questions are inserted into the consultation, but they're listed at the back. Even if you just want to have a look at the questions, pick out the ones that you're happy you get and answer those. There is a 25-ish page summary of the 560 odd page consultation. Read through that before answering the questions, but it's very easy to submit a response, even if it's only to one question, to just submit a response and have your say.
I think the last question, as I said before, you could miss all those questions and just feel your name and address in it at the beginning, and the last question you could say, this is what I'm concerned about, this is what I want changing. Even that would have your say. So we hope you find that useful. They are the what we consider to be some of the most important changes proposed in this document. I would like to thank Joe Derbyshire, Katie Kendrick, Chris Last for coming to Maidstone Studios, where they are filming Jules Holland's show tomorrow night, just there, and we've just walked past Paul Weller's changing room, which means quite a lot to me. But thank you very much for watching this, and we really hope it's helped you.
Thank you.
Thank you.